we have this broken record that our schools are failing because teacher turnover is too high. And if we only fix teacher turnover, everything will be okay. And I don't think that's the answer, because it wasn't okay when we didn't have high teacher turnover for rural, remote, indigenous students. So what are the other things we can be looking at? Not that it isn't critical that we have excellent teachers, but what is it that's going to enable excellent teachers to be successful in these environments? And that's what we've been missing really for as long as there's been a Western schooling system here.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Dr. Diane Hirshberg, who is the director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research, commonly referred to as ISER. We talk about her backstory and how she made it to Alaska and ISER, but also her research into rural education and potential solutions for improving it. This episode marks a milestone at the East Anchorage Book Club. It is my 100th interview, and I am so glad that it was with Diane discussing Alaska education. Dr. Diane Hirshberg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So you're the director of ISER.
Yes.
Institute of Social and Economic Research.
That's correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about your organization, what you do?
Sure. We are the oldest public policy research institute in the state of Alaska. We actually were founded by the legislature in order to provide some of that critical information data analysis that the state needed in order to make the right decisions as a new state. And so originally we were the Institute of Social, Economic, and Governmental Research, and always affectionately known as the Institute of Everything, because for now almost, I guess it's 62 years, we have studied everything from the economy of Alaska and fiscal issues in the state to education policy to socio-ecological issues, and now what's going on with climate change, fire risk in our communities, but a little of anything and everything that comes to us. We're at the University of Alaska Anchorage, but we also operate fairly independently. We bring in the vast majority of our own funding.
And you were originally at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the original director was Vic Fisher?
So the first director was Vic Fisher when it was University of Alaska. We were at UAF for a brief moment. This was during that period of time when UAA was becoming a standalone university. And so we moved from Fairbanks to Anchorage, physically in the 70s and bureaucratically in the early 80s.
How long have you been the director?
I've been the director for, I guess, a little over 2 years now.
And what's that experience been like?
A bit of a fire hose. I stepped in as interim director when my predecessor left a bit earlier than he had originally said he was going to leave. And we were in the middle of a search already, and I had applied to be the permanent director. It's been a learning experience. I had a lot of background at UAA. I've been here for 20 years. I've been the faculty president, which really helped because being involved in governance, I knew all the players. I have a lot of relationships that allow me to have the conversations I need to have that would be really tough if you were coming from outside and didn't know people. But one of the changes is our last director was considered a full-time director, and I'm not. I still have a research component, and I'm also serving as vice president academic for University of the Arctic, which is a consortium of about 185 universities and institutes across the circumpolar north and beyond. And so I've been mashing together three very different sets of responsibilities.
So the last director, their full-time job was being director, but you are the director and you have these other things that you do in order to make a full-time position.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem fair.
It actually feels like a little bit more than a full-time position. But I also love my research, and now I've branched out from deep dive into education policy to much more this question about how do communities become sustainable across the North using, obviously, education and knowledge sharing, but also a lot of work around energy, which is why I'm spending so much time up in Kotzebue and Galena.
Right, we were in Kotzebue yesterday together.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your research. I want to talk about the book that came out this year.
Yep.
I want to talk about all of that. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about you. Where did you grow up?
I am East Coast, West Coast mutt. I was born in Massachusetts, lived there till I was 10, and then we moved to Los Angeles to the San Fernando Valley. I went to high school at the school about which Moon Unit wrote the song Valley Girls, for those who are old enough to remember that. And then I went up to Berkeley for my undergraduate education.
What did your parents do?
My father was a shoe manufacturer, and my mother was an unhappy housewife who got into political organizing. So she was a volunteer with the League of Women Voters and the National Women's Political Caucus. And when we moved to LA, she started a career first for the mayor of Los Angeles and then working in CETA and JTPA, so federally funded job training, and then ran offices for city council members for a number of years as well.
I'm sure that the Los Angeles City Council is probably pretty intense and lively.
It is. I was raised working on campaigns.
Because you got to LA when you were 10.
I was 10. And so by the time I was 14, I was making phone calls for political candidates and volunteering at fundraisers as well. And I actually stopped out of college to work for a legislator for some time and also do political fundraising. And
Stopped college to work for a legislator?
I took about 6 months off and worked in a legislative office.
What year was that?
84.
Okay. Which study is undergrad?
Peace and conflict studies and Slavic language and literature.
Interesting. Slavic language and literature.
I really wanted to read Tolstoy in Russian.
Did you?
Poetry, short stories, but not very well. I was very involved in campus politics. I was a Berkeley undergraduate. I was in the student senate. I was involved in the peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement and the anti-apartheid movement. And then I got into education through deciding that part of the issue was people needed to be informed in their votes in order to make the right decisions. I looked at what's going on around the world and I decided U.S. policy would be better if we were more informed. And that was how I worked my way back to education for people who didn't have opportunities otherwise.
And you got your master's at Columbia?
In public policy and administration.
And then what?
And then I worked at an education research clearinghouse at UCLA and moved into a PhD program at UCLA.
In education?
In education. And that was how I ended up here because we had a funding for a national study of detracking or reducing or eliminating ability grouping in racially mixed secondary schools. And we put out a call for schools to participate. And there was a school in Southeast Alaska that volunteered. And so every graduate student had a couple schools they were responsible for. And so I had a school in West Virginia and I had a school in Alaska.
What is detracking?
So that is, I don't know if you went through, most of us went through schools where there were the basic and maybe the honors or gifted or bluebirds and robins. And there was an assumption that kids who were more academically successful or less successful needed to be grouped together in order to make the instruction easier. And all the research says no. And actually, although we continue to fight this today, a lot of what happens is kids who are behind get further behind and kids who are accelerated get more accelerated. We have highly gifted programs in the Anchorage School District, for example, that get resourced at a higher rate than the programs for kids who aren't identified as anything special. Every child is special, but we don't treat them that way.
I do remember, I think it was in second grade that I was tested for gifted and talented, and
Yeah.
I was not selected, and I cried.
Yeah.
And thinking about it right now, I still have some of that residual.
Yeah.
My friends were smarter than me.
It is easier to teach kids that we think are at one level, but instead what we're missing is kids develop at different levels. Kids have very different areas in which they excel, and to privilege only a narrow standardized test. I excelled at those. I think the way standardized tests are built, it worked great for me, but there are other kids who look at things and do things in ways that I can never conceptualize. And why am I considered more gifted than those kids? There's just a lot of research on how our assumptions about children that are grounded in race, ethnicity, class, social class, bias, how we look at children. There was a lawsuit that my graduate advisor was involved in Chicago, where Black children who scored higher on the standardized tests were put in lower placements than white children who scored lower. So we know that there's implicit and explicit bias that is driving how children get identified and their abilities identified. And the other thing is prior learning is no indication of ability to learn. And that's where a lot of this comes down. So if you look at the socioeconomic stratification in this district or anywhere in most of the country, there are places that are much more intentional about saying we're not going to do that. There are places when we had the movement of inclusion that
with special ed students,
special ed students, but also inclusion really could be that you don't take those bright sparks out of the classroom. You find ways to give them opportunities to accelerate at the same time they bring along their classmates.
So Southeast Alaska was one of the schools. West Virginia was one of the schools. So it sounds like it could have ended up in West Virginia or Southeast Alaska.
And really, even ending up at UCLA for my doctorate, I thought I was accepted for a doctoral program at Teachers College. And I had thought I was going to go to DC. I wanted to work in the federal education policy realm. But I began to realize the difference between being a really successful staffer and being a researcher who could maybe drive some of those conversations. And that was how I ended up in a PhD. But Columbia University Teachers College gave me a fellowship that would have allowed me to go into more debt, which I managed to do anyway in my PhD. But I was dating a guy who wanted to move back to LA. So I thought, what the heck? It was very unplanned. Mm-hmm. And when I got to Alaska, I had that experience of getting off the plane and feeling like there were magnets in the ground. So
where did you get off the plane?
In Juneau. And so even though I lived in LA, I never felt really at home in LA. And when I got to Juneau, I was like, oh my God, this is home, which was really a weird sensation.
And what year was that?
That was 1991. And I had no idea. I'd studied the tundra when I was in 6th grade. I really had no idea what Alaska was. I had no idea of the diversity other than a little bit of prepping about the schools in the state. I walked in, and in fact, my first phone call to see Alaska to see if I could interview somebody about education, they hung up on me. I'm sure I said something really offensive, although I've since had plenty of people who are clinking say, oh no, we hang up on each other all the time. But it was like a colonial researcher. But thank God I met people like Dal Davidson. And that school was full of amazing educators and the community. And going back over multiple years, and it's the conversations when somebody invites you over and starts telling you about their experience living in rural Alaska and what that meant. It was powerful.
You said you felt the magnets.
Yeah.
We could feel the magnets and still not find a pathway to move here and live here. So how did you find that path?
Frankly, some of it was ISER's research. In the early 90s, looking for research on education, I ran into ISER's work. That said, it took me a long time. First of all, I moved from LA back to Berkeley. I couldn't stand living in LA any longer. So I had a job at UC Berkeley that kept me from finishing my dissertation for a while. And then I finally finished up and actually got a job at the University of Oregon. And one of the things that was going on in Oregon was they had a cohort of students from Anchorage School District and the Mat-Su getting a PhD. So I was teaching students from Alaska, having finished up a dissertation about Alaska, having at that point spent multiple times just coming up and being.
When you came up, did you go to Southeast? Was that where you were going?
That was originally where I was going. So my dissertation, I interviewed legislators on the Health, Education, and Social Services Committee to understand how they were making decisions about education, and particularly for Alaska Native students. And
I can tell you how they do it now. It's how they feel.
that might have come through a little bit, as well as ideology. And I also interviewed state board members. The commissioner at the time was Shirley Holloway. Probably the most fun interview I've ever done. She is just amazing, but it was so much fun.
And that was a time where there were 100 teachers applying for every job, where the way education was working in Alaska is definitely different than the way it is now.
Yeah. It was, but it was also, I was there for the first conversations about charter schools, which was very interesting. And also, Tony Knowles was governor. And there was a lot of discussion over that period of time from when I was studying the single school to studying what was going on in the legislature around a lot of recognition of ongoing challenges with Indigenous education, right? So Judy Kleinfeld's piece that she wrote for ISER, which we joke sometimes you change the date to be some of the same issues. And even though there was money, we still were not transforming things in ways that probably need to be done.
You know what? Because you brought up Indigenous education, can we talk about your most recent article?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. It's actually a chapter in a book.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Sure. This book, so it's called Education, Equity, and Inclusion. It is actually the second publication from a group of us that are all part of what we call a thematic network. And this is a network of education researchers across the North and beyond through the University of the Arctic. So we've got partners in all of the Arctic nations and in the UK. And I say all the Arctic nations because we were in the process of publishing this when Russia invaded Ukraine. So we were able to include our Russian colleagues. We have no contact with them now, which is incredibly sad. But this group has been working together for 7 years, 8 years. Our first publication was produced for the Sustainable Development Working Group of the Arctic Council. And that one, we called it more of a desktop study. It was during COVID, so we were doing it from our own spaces. But it was a publication that the Arctic Council endorsed to talk about circumpolar education. This one was to get more in-depth and, in some cases, more cross-national on how do we begin looking at transformation in education across the North. So the chapter that I co-authored was following on the first chapter that we did in the last book to really say, what do we need to do differently? Because we have this broken record. We have this broken record that our schools are failing because teacher turnover is too high. And if we only fix teacher turnover, everything will be okay. But I don't think that's the answer, because it wasn't okay when we didn't have high teacher turnover for rural, remote, Indigenous students. So what are the other things we can be looking at? Not that it isn't critical that we have excellent teachers, but what is it that's going to enable excellent teachers to be successful in these environments? And that's what we've been missing really for as long as there's been a Western schooling system here.
I read your chapter in the book this morning. It's really good. I learned a lot. I would love to have you read a little bit from the chapter.
Sure.
Just to educate some readers about some things I didn't know.
Sure. So over 80% or more than 300 of Alaska's communities are not connected to a contiguous road system. These are accessible only by plane or boat, and most of the remote communities are predominantly indigenous. And yet, Alaska's school system mirrors the education systems across the rest of the nation, and with a few exceptions, the schools operate like those outside.
That's interesting to me because I think we often think in terms of population, and I represent Anchorage, and so I talk about Anchorage School District, but having over 300 communities off the road system and thinking that those communities have a school, it's just a huge number.
Yeah, certainly we really have two very different environments in which learning in an institutional setting is happening. And I'm really careful now that it's so many words, but there's learning that happens on the land, in communities, in our homes, with our families. And we so think about schools as being these four walls, and they weren't always that way. And maybe they shouldn't always be that way.
Mm-hmm. I would like to have you read a couple more sentences.
Sure.
Speaking about this issue. Yeah.
Great. In 2018 to 2019, there were 7,899 certificated teachers in Alaska. The state does not report the ethnicity of teachers, but old work indicated that the vast majority of teachers are white. Fewer than 5% of teachers were Alaska Native. Teacher turnover in rural schools in Alaska averages more than twice as high as in urban or urban fringe schools, and about 1/3 higher than in hub communities, those larger communities that provide services to smaller villages in a region.
Right. So I think when we talk about teacher turnover, again, I'm very Anchorage specific, and I'm talking about what we can do to reduce turnover in Anchorage.
Yeah.
But it's twice as high in rural Alaska or more.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to bring up the fact that these schools have predominantly indigenous children being taught by white teachers who come in and stay for a year or two and then leave because they can't handle this anymore,
Or this was their great adventure. I'm going to live in Alaska for a couple of years. This is really cool, and I'm going to go back home. Of course, that was 2019 data, and now we come to post-COVID, post another economic set of hurdles, both in-state and outside. And we have way more teacher openings. We have districts that are bringing in
J1 visas from out of the country.
Yeah. When we flew, I'm not sure about this, but when we flew yesterday, I was in line with a group of Filipino women that were all going up to the North Slope. I was chatting with them, and I thought I should have said, are you teachers? Because we've got districts that, they're bringing in people that are not only 3,000 or 5,000 miles away, but they're 10,000 or 15,000 miles away from their families.
And not just white Americans who are having to adjust to Alaska Native culture, but perhaps people from another country.
Although they may be more successful.
Yes.
I'm hearing that particularly with our Filipino educators, because a lot of them come from scattered villages and islands, and the Philippines is an archipelago. It's similar that they understand this.
There might be some crossover that somebody from Kansas would have.
Exactly. That takes me back to when I was studying education. I'd go to this big national conference, American Education Research Association, and people would look at me and say, why should we care about Alaska? It doesn't have anything to do with what we do. And I go to a Circumpolar, the International Congress of Arctic Social Sciences, and it's my people. They want to hear what we're doing. So I do think sometimes we spend so much time looking at the lower 48, including for our education policy. Mm-hmm. And we would be better off looking at Finland or Greenland or Nunavut in Canada rather than Kansas and Florida.
But I think I lived in Finland. So I think looking at what's happening in Lapland as opposed to what's happening in Helsinki. But maybe I'm wrong.
No, you are spot on. I spent a month in Lapland last year. And to find out that every child who is Sami, if they're not living in their community, they have a right to be studying the Sami language. And so if you're in Helsinki, if you're in Oulu, the schools have to set up a space. So a couple days a week, there's now this distance delivered Sami language in all of the Sami languages that are spoken, including those that were quite threatened. So, yes, they're thinking very thoughtfully, or to go to the Sami Education Institute in Inari. And it's that sense that the traditional handicrafts, learning how to work with reindeer leather, learning how to work with reindeer antler or make some of the traditional part of the national costume, is side by side with computer programming and nursing and business school. Mm-hmm. It's not separating that part of you, that Sami, from that part of you that's a college student.
I want to talk about some of the solutions that you guys bring forward, but I think I'll have you read one more paragraph from here, talking about just some of the issues.
Current school calendars keep students in school when subsistence cycles would dictate their participation in critical activities. For example, during moose hunting in September in the interior of Alaska, or hunting for migrating birds in April instead of taking standardized tests. But it's not just pedagogy or the calendar. It's also whom the state designates as being an approved educator capable of sharing knowledge within the institutional setting of public schools. With just a few exceptions, it does not allow local communities to determine who should be considered an appropriate educator for their context. Moreover, the system fails to recognize the value of knowledge held by elders or others considered knowledge bearers by their community.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what the crux of the matter is addressing that issue of less than 5% of the educators being Alaska Native,
right,
and having this. You talk about the boarding schools, you talk about separating people from their families and their culture, their language, but really not just putting a Band-Aid on it, but saying, let's tear the system down and start over.
And it's not to say that there isn't a role for non-Indigenous educators. There absolutely is. It's how we go from privileging one set of knowledge over another to how we look at how both these knowledge systems contribute to somebody being a whole person who can function in a very multicultural, complex society and make choices. There are people, and I think in the interior of Alaska, I've spent some time in Arctic Village, and I love this sense that there's all these PhDs who work at UAF and are still home for caribou hunting and for snow machine racing and for really critical spiritual gatherings. And so again, seeing a whole person can be both in the Western academic setting and in their home community, and frankly, taking that home culture and transforming the academic setting to be a better, more nurturing, more successful experience for everybody in it. Mm-hmm. I think that's the other piece that gets lost. Years ago, we had the Alaska Partnership for Teacher Enhancement, which is a big teacher quality enhancement grant that UAA had. And we had teacher professional development in rural communities where you were both doing content, but also getting grounded in the life of the community. And teachers would come back to Anchorage and say, I now have tools to better meet the needs of all my students, not just my Indigenous students. I now understand better where they came from, but it also works with my Samoan students, my African-American students, or my white students, because hands-on, place-based, project-based learning is more engaging for everybody. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think we almost feel it's ironic that we are reestablishing what we tried to literally beat out of people in terms of educational practices.
Well, you talked in the chapter about this imposition of kids in desks and being expected to sit for a certain number of hours and learn. And I was like, yeah, that's not good for any kids.
No. And it is why in Finland, they have a 6-hour day, and 1 hour of that day is outside in real activity. Plus there's lunchtime. Plus there's other breaks in what has broadly been considered one of the most successful education systems in the world. We are not having them learning for that X number of minutes a day that we are so focused on in this country. I was just in the Faroe Islands. Their kids are dismissed somewhere between noon and 12:30
That's north of Scotland.
Actually, it's halfway between Iceland and Scotland, and it's a Danish protectorate, but very Viking independent. And again, it's the idea is that you have quality learning time, and then the teachers have quality prep time, but it doesn't have to be this 8-9 hours a day of seat time. That's not healthy for children. And it goes counter to what we know about development with the brain.
I'm glad you bring it up because I will confess that I am one of those legislators who's constantly bringing up the fact that Alaska has a shorter school year, that we have less instruction days than other districts in the lower 48. And I'm constantly sort of harping on that, being like, maybe we should start school a little earlier. Maybe our school year should go a little longer. Maybe we should look at the fact that we have less instruction time, and maybe I'm part of the problem.
And it's also looking at what we do with that time, because in some cases, the number of days and the number of minutes are two different things, right? Because you have shorter days, fewer minutes, but more days.
Which probably works better.
Yeah. And also more flexible days. I know, was it I won't say Lake and Penn, one of our districts that was looking at those 2 weeks of moose hunting time when the kids aren't there anyway. Why not? And then the next question is, do you use moose hunting as a curriculum? Because hunting moose is historic, it's cultural, it's spiritual. There's also probably some great literature. I know Moby Dick better than I know of an equivalent book in moose hunting, but that we can go find at Hemingway.
So you could find like a lot of different subjects.
Somebody can be deer hunting and it can be still used in that context. And then there's biology, there's nutrition, there's physiology.
Culinary arts.
Exactly. A moose. I still remember when a principal said to me, people in this community don't care about school, they care about whaling. And I said, build your curriculum on whaling. Now, North Slope Borough actually school district has a lot of curriculum about whaling. That includes leadership, right? What does it mean to be a leader in a whaling community? There's so much we can do grounded in who we are, but ain't going to happen if we're adopting books from the Florida Virtual Academy or from Texas or from California.
Right. Yeah. Tribal compacting, that's something that's discussed in chapter as a potential solution, a potential way of getting to this other place.
Yep.
Can you just talk a little bit about what that is and how that might work?
We're still figuring out what that is in this state. And in fact, I had reached out because I understand there's a new report, and I haven't seen it yet, that lists what the first 5 tribal compacting efforts are planning to do. But it is a way to say we're going to let a tribe or a consortia of tribe, like Tlingit Haida is one of the consortia, create their own educational system. And it's trying to minimize state mandates and to see what does it look like when a tribe comes up with its own model. And I haven't seen the plans. I don't know what folk are looking at. I spent some time in Ayaprin Narvik, which of course was that first Yupik immersion school. And that was a school that was within a school district as a charter school, but you saw a very different sensibility when you walked into the building of how the community was integrated, how the children and adults interacted with each other. And I think you would expect to see in a tribally run school even much more of that, whether it be a lot more land-based education, a lot more language education, perhaps a different set of benchmarks for what it means for children to be successful. We get very rigid in our thinking about here's our language and mathematics benchmarks. And there's reasons to say here's this progression through that, but that misses the parts about being able to know how you're supposed to treat your elders and to know the cycles in your community for subsistence and how that plays into it, to know what's the appropriate governance structure in your community. All of those things I'm hoping are going to be part of it. But I think it's going to be challenging because all of us have gone through the same school system. This was a challenge in Greenland, where I have a friend who was working on their effort to decolonize their education system. And all of their Greenlandic teachers had gone through a Danish school system. So you've got to unlearn that.
So there's still going to be these sort of internalized prejudices about what the classroom looks like, what assessment looks like,
right?
What accountability is.
Abiyaya, and she's come here and spoken a few times. And I think there are some people involved in tribal compacting projects who've worked with Abiyaya. She talked a lot about mental decolonization, that it's both the colonizer and the colonized. We all have to have a different set of eyes and thinking, and it's really hard to break that down, but collectively we can work with each other to do that.
Or at the very least, recognize that lens that we're going to be viewing everything through.
Exactly.
You stayed in Alaska.
Yeah.
And you started working for ISER right away then?
I did. My job at Oregon was a 1-year visiting professor job. And I said to them, I'm not teaching an entire year by distance to these Alaskan students without getting to meet them. So I came up and let ISER know I was coming. I'd already reached out to ISER. I'd applied for the wrong position at one point. I knew a few people here. So I actually taught from here back to my Oregon students, because the way we were running this doctoral program was in a TV studio in Oregon, and then the Anchorage School District set up a studio.
So early.
It was
like this was 90s?
No, this was now 2000. Now we're in 2002.
Okay.
So it was still early. And so I backtalked to Oregon, but I also then was invited by ISER to give a talk on my dissertation. And one of my students at that time was working for Cook Inlet Tribal Council. So he put the word out, and about 50 people came, a lot of Indigenous folk. I was terrified. I hadn't done a big talk on my research, and I got this great feedback because it was the first time a lot of Indigenous leaders had seen a white person deconstruct other white people. Usually we get the white people coming up and studying Native people. No, I was studying white people and how they were looking at Indigenous people. And they really appreciated that as a different set of lenses. And ISER put together a job for me, invited me to apply for it, because their last education policy person, Bill McDermott, had gone on to UW at that point, and there was an opening. And I came up, and it was just great. I was pulled right into working with the Alaska Partnership for Teacher Enhancement. And actually, not only was it a great experience to meet teachers and principals from around the state, but I spent 2 summers in Akuychuk, a couple weeks each summer in Akuychuk. And the second summer, I met my husband there.
What was your husband doing there?
He's a teacher in the Anchorage School District who was doing professional development. So I was an evaluator for the grant, and he was one of the participants. It really works. I've joked for a while that if we could do Alaska teacher placement.eharmony.com, we might actually get some more teachers to stay up here.
And your husband was committed to staying in Alaska. Was he originally from Alaska?
No, and he wasn't necessarily committed. He'd been a wildlife biologist. He'd worked a year as a tech in Lake Clark. He'd worked for a year as a tech in McGrath. And he'd been in a nasty car accident and couldn't carry a backpack at that point. So he became a science teacher and came up to teach and wasn't sure. And I don't think he would have stayed in Anchorage if it weren't for me. I think he would have moved to a rural district because he's from rural Wisconsin. But for me, he stayed in the big city of Anchorage.
I'm going to make a confession because I think it relates to teacher recruitment and retention. But when I found out that your husband was a middle school teacher, I make a lot of assumptions about a man who's a middle school teacher who's married to a PhD director of an important institute in Alaska. And then I looked at that thought and thought, wow, that's why it's so hard to recruit teachers. Right. Because people don't think that being a middle school teacher is on par with so many other things.
And he does have 2 master's degrees. And my best friend is a middle school counselor. I am surrounded by educators and they work way hard. I work hard and it's nothing compared to what my friends who are in K-12 do. But yeah, when we started dating, he actually at one point said, "Are you sure you want to be dating just a teacher?" I was like, oh my gosh, teachers are bread and butter. It is the hardest job, first of all. It's incredibly hard. And secondly, for me, it is, I don't know, it's what keeps me going. That time I get to spend in classrooms, whether I'm observing teachers or students or just getting to sleep in a school because I'm in rural Alaska and that's the place where you can rent a room, is sleeping in a sleeping bag in a classroom. That's what nourishes and restores, is being around the kids. I teach every year. I get to lecture to the middle college, high school kids that are in the Tom Case Leadership Academy. And when it used to be over at Clark, every year I'd go over to Clark.
For folks who don't know what the
middle college high school is, a dual enrollment program that is intended to take students who are from underrepresented communities that might not realize that they're college material, see themselves as college material, and to get them onto a campus early while they're still in high school to take classes that count toward both high school and college, and give them that extra push. A middle college is getting these kids onto this campus where they can say, oh, I see myself as a college student.
I don't know the numbers, but I would guess that your husband is an anomaly of a male who made their career as a public school teacher.
It's very different elementary to secondary. And Alaska has a whole bunch of people like my husband that teaching is their second career. And in particular in biology. Thank you, Fish and Game, for getting guys up here who do 20 years in Fish and Game. And my husband wasn't that because of the car accident, but he would have ended up there. And his closest friend when he first started at Central was a Fish and Game veteran who then moved into biology teaching. I laugh because every few years there's a story about, ooh, somebody brought in a moose. I guess the latest was Eagle River.
Jesse Bjorkman did it in Nikiski.
Yeah. But somebody else just did it in Eagle River, I think, or Chugiak High School, where my husband also worked. And we laugh at it because it's these Fish and Game guys who go bring something and understand how to walk kids through both, again, the biology, the physiology, the nutritional aspects, and how to properly care for game meat once you've slaughtered it, all of which are so cool to do here because it connects kids to the land as well as to their intellectual development.
I brought it up because talking to another education person, they had mentioned that in the 50s and 60s, it was still the time where women had basically three different professions: nursing, secretary, school teacher. But we've moved towards where women in general have many more options.
Yeah.
But education has suffered in a way that we don't have this enforced profession, and that in some way definitely plays a part in the lack of teachers that we have.
Yeah. That, and we know that professions that are highly dominated by women tend to have depressed salaries. And somehow nursing has caught up. So salaries have gone up. And of course, I notice how many more male nurses there are. Teaching salaries have never caught up to where they should be. Again, my husband has 2 masters. There's a whole bunch of teachers. At a minimum, they have a bachelor's. A huge number of them have a master's, and they are paid less than people with an associate's degree in a technical area. Now, sometimes I laugh because they do the trash collector to education. Trash collectors keep us from spreading disease. They are critical. In some cases, they are more critical. I love my doctors. I love my nurses. Trash collectors keep us from spreading disease more than doctors and nurses. So we have to recognize those values. But teachers, we will not have a good doctor, nurse, or trash collector if we don't have a good teacher. And they are so underpaid and overworked and undervalued. It's offensive. And And I don't know how we change that because there has been such an ideological attack on teachers, as well as the profession changing so that teachers don't get recognized as professionals and don't have the autonomy they used to have.
I'm going to bring up something maybe controversial. It's not an Alaska only problem, but this movement towards homeschooling, and what I find offensive about it is this idea that any parent would be a better teacher than someone who studied education and how to be a teacher.
Yeah.
It really upsets me.
And parents are great at educating children into the values of their family and their culture and their spirituality. But there's a knowledge base. If we value moving kids into the preparation for more technical and professional areas, there's a lot of skill that's involved in that. And so my husband worked in a homeschool for a little while, so I got a bit of a window into it. And there's such a variety because I know we have faculty here who homeschool their kids when they take a sabbatical and the kids go with them and travel around the country. It's a very different experience when your parents have doctorates and are very privileged than homeschooling by people who themselves are not well educated. What we're doing is we're actually growing the socioeconomic and sociocultural divide with some of our homeschooling programs. There's a huge difference between correspondence schools, like recognizing that parents are working remotely and their kids aren't near a school. And the old model we had, mail the books out, mail the tests out, and people who are in Anchorage and getting resources, and we don't have any accountability. The fact that kids don't show up for standardized tests in the homeschools and the parents still get their allotments. Humans are social critters. Now, some of these kids I know there are, during COVID in particular, there were a lot of pods that were created. This is the problem, is homeschooling is not home. There's so many different models.
There's an exception to every rule. You can find a great homeschool model.
But I actually think that the Anchorage School District's optional school programs show that you can have a real robust set of options for people that include things that look like homeschools, but that still are giving kids certificated teachers, other children's social experiences, and hopefully some rigor and expectations and assessment going along with that. And one of the issues with those is also making sure that every parent and every child has access to what they need to make the choice. Because one of the problems when I've run the demographic differences in the populations at the different schools, it's really clear because we don't have public transportation that works very well for a lot of schools and families. It takes a lot to figure out the optional school programs, apply for them, and then get your kid to them if they're accepted. We have, again, a socioeconomic divide.
We're getting to the end of our time, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I'm just going to say that I interviewed the superintendent of ASD, Jared Bryant, a couple of weeks ago. It was a very pro-charter school talk. Mm-hmm. My child does go to Rilke-Schule, to a charter school. And I just want to acknowledge that there's problems with that. Yeah. There's problems with kids leaving the traditional public school to go to a charter school because their parents have the means to take them and pick them up and meet the volunteer requirements that the schools have and the amount of parent participation that's needed. That's not something that everyone can do, and that's not fair.
But there are ways to take that and make more access. And that's one thing I remember, I don't know if they're still doing it, but at one point, Cambridge, in order to desegregate their schools, what they did was they made everybody lottery into something. And they looked at the most popular programs and then they replicated them. And we have a little bit of that because we have Chugach optional, we have Susitna optional, and we do have our language immersion program scattered. Maybe I'd really like my kid to go to Rilke Schule, but my neighborhood school has Spanish, Chinese, Japanese. Right. Doesn't matter because dual language learning is amazing for a kid no matter what the language is, right? We could look at doing something like that in this district. We could look at every school having some kind of program that for parents who have the means and want to opt in, they can. And for families, if you're living in Mountain View with buses that only go so far, then in your neighborhood school, let's create some kind of thing. And I know we're talking about that with the academies and the high schools.
I was just going to say.
Yeah. And so the question is, how are we doing that in such a way that really is making sure, every kid.
And I'll just mention College Gate Elementary has Yupik immersion.
Yes. And I got a chance to visit it, although they were having fire and active shooter drills the day we went there. I took my colleague from Finland there. Oh. So she got to experience what you hope people look at us.
So I lived in Finland and I had a Finnish boyfriend, and it was around the time of Columbine. It was shortly after that. Michael Moore had made the movie about Columbine.
Oh, yeah.
And we went and saw the movie. And he said afterwards, I'm so sorry. I don't want to visit your country.
Yeah. Yeah. It's shocking to people in other places. But having a Yupik immersion program and it's in College Gate. It's not like it's in the middle of a community with a lot of Yupik people living around there. And that's awesome. Because of the stuff going on, I didn't get a chance to look at all the kids in the program. I loved it. Iu Pranella at Narvik in Bethel, there's a lot of
diverse
kids.
Group of kids.
Yeah. And the first kid, when the first group that had gone all the way from kindergarten to high school graduated from Bethel High, the valedictorian was a white kid who started in the Yupik immersion program and gave his speech in Yupik.
That's so important because that gives value to that this is a language for everyone.
Yeah. And it does, as like I said, I studied Russian, studied a little bit of French. Mostly I can order food in every language. But it's a window into a different way of seeing the world and expressing what's around you. Mm-hmm. And particularly with our heritage languages in the state, it's also a way of understanding the land that I'll never have as somebody who I know little phrases in indigenous languages, but I haven't.
You don't think in another.
Yes, not in a language grounded in this place. And it really does transform how you understand what's going on around you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
For being here today. Do you have a book that you want to recommend to our listeners?
Yes, fiction, because my pleasure is reading fiction when I don't have to read for work. And there's a book called Stolen. It's a contemporary story of the Sami reindeer herder experience, but so many of the issues that come up about identity, who is considered Sami, what is the relationship between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, who has the right to the land. I think it's actually got a lot of relevance to here while allowing us to see it from a different place. It's a beautiful book.
Thanks again. We didn't get a chance to talk about Arctic energy. We'll have to do that next time.
Yes.
Because it affects our education system.
It does. And the
Alaska.
costs are, considerable.
Right. So next time, but thanks again.
Thank you.
The name of the novel that Dr. Hirshberg recommended is called Stolen, and it was written by the Swedish journalist of Sami descent, Anne-Helene Lastadius. It is being made into a movie by Netflix. The book that Diane was an editor for and has the chapter in it that she read from in this interview is called Education, Equity, and Inclusion, Teaching and Learning for a Sustainable North. That book is an open access publication, and I am dropping the link for it in the show notes. There's lots of interesting perspectives in there. Thank you, listeners, for sticking with me through 100 interviews. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com.